The scent of turpentine lingered in the air of the Vermont college studio, mixing with the sharp bite of fall wind that crept through the cracked-open windows. Elena Bradford stood before a half-finished canvas, dabbing pale streaks of ochre and violet across a silhouette of a woman reaching for the stars. Her paint-stained hoodie clung to her frame, her curls pinned into a messy bun, and her headphones whispered Nina Simone's "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free." Art had always been Elena's escape, her mirror, her rebellion, her healing. Raised by her mother Lydia after her father left when she was just 2, Elena found home in colors and canvas. She studied psychology by day, art by night, with hopes of fusing therapy and creativity for broken souls. Her dreams were bold, but not louder than her insecurities. Growing up in a world that rarely listened to black women's pain, Elena had learned to whisper her dreams to the canvas instead. And on that very Thursday afternoon, as she layered a subtle gold outline on her painting, she never expected that her life was about to pivot with the entrance of one man, an uninvited observer who walked into the studio as though the place was his. Ryan Lockwood entered with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Tall, clean-shaven, sharply dressed in a charcoal wool coat and a cashmere scarf knotted like a Parisian native, he didn't look like a student, because he wasn't one. Ryan was a tech entrepreneur who had been invited to speak at a neighboring campus about blockchain startups. But his boredom with formal lectures led him to wander, and his curiosity brought him through the doors of the Fine Arts Building, where he claimed he was looking for inspiration. He found it in Elena. For several minutes, he stood quietly, watching her paint without saying a word, and Elena, ever used to being invisible, didn't notice. When she finally turned, startled to find a stranger observing her, his first words were, "You paint like your soul's on fire." Cheesy, perhaps, but spoken with such charm and sincerity that it disarmed her. Elena didn't believe in love at first sight, but something about Ryan's quiet intensity pulled her in. He asked questions, real ones, not just about her art, but about what it meant to her, why she painted women, why the stars were always above them. And for the first time in a long while, Elena didn't have to translate herself. She felt seen. Their connection blossomed quickly but dangerously, like a match thrown in dry woods. In the weeks that followed, Ryan made himself a fixture in Elena's world, bringing her coffee during night classes, listening to her talk about her thesis on emotional resilience, and showing up at her art exhibits with the kind of admiration that made her blush. He shared his story, a privileged upbringing in Chicago, a brief corporate stint, and then a risky leap into tech that paid off big. But what fascinated Elena most was not his money, it was the way he listened, how he said her art was revolution in quiet brushstrokes. Still, even in her enchantment, subtle shadows lingered. Ryan was magnetic but guarded, often deflecting personal questions with charming misdirection. He never spoke of his family in detail. He brushed off Elena's desire to meet them with lines like, "Trust me, you're better off not knowing them." But she convinced herself it was nothing, that she was simply overthinking like always. After all, how could someone who looked at her like she painted the stars be anything but sincere? Elena didn't know that the man who had stepped into her studio wasn't looking for art, he was looking for someone he could mold, someone who would eventually give up everything for him. And that's exactly what she would do. The early November air in Montpelier carried with it a quiet chill that clung to car windows and whispered along the edges of leafless trees. Elena had spent the entire morning cleaning her modest off-campus apartment, lighting cinnamon candles and fluffing every pillow like her life depended on it. It wasn't just any visit. Her mother, Lydia Bradford, was coming for dinner, and tonight would be the first time she met Ryan. Elena had spent days trying to convince Lydia that Ryan was different, kind, driven, full of vision. But mothers have a sixth sense, especially ones like Lydia, who had seen too many promises broken and too many men leave good women stranded. Lydia arrived in a royal blue wool coat, her salt and pepper afro styled immaculately, lips painted the same rich burgundy she'd worn since Elena was a child. She gave her daughter a long, bone-tight hug before turning with guarded curiosity to the sharply dressed man who opened the wine. "So, you're Ryan," she said, and though her voice was cordial, her eyes had already begun reading him like scripture. Dinner was roasted chicken, rosemary potatoes, and cornbread, Elena's attempt at recreating her mother's Sunday warmth. But warmth was the one thing missing from Lydia's side of the table. She listened quietly while Ryan talked about his tech ventures and his recent contract with a logistics firm in Manhattan. Yet her fork paused every time he skipped over a question about his childhood or gave vague answers about his intentions with Elena. "You seem successful," Lydia finally said, tilting her head as she sipped her water. "But success without roots often leaves a man drifting." Ryan's smile didn't falter, but his fingers tightened slightly around the stem of his wine glass. Elena quickly jumped in to ease the tension, laughing nervously and changing the subject to their art show plans for the winter. But the silence that followed Lydia's statement hung like smoke in the room. Later, as Ryan stepped out to take a business call, Lydia turned to Elena, her voice low but firm. "He's handsome and clever, but something about that boy don't sit right with me. You remember what I told you about pretty boys with silver tongues? They always come with rusted secrets." Elena brushed it off, but the words echoed. After Ryan left that evening, Lydia sat in the living room, folding the same napkin over and over in her lap, her mind heavy with unease. She had seen that gleam before, the polished charm that masked something darker beneath. Elena tried to defend him, explaining how he made her feel valued, how he believed in her dreams and never made her feel like she had to shrink herself. But Lydia wasn't moved by charm. She was moved by consistency, and one dinner told her everything she needed to know. "You're an artist, baby," she said softly, standing to put on her coat. "Don't let anyone paint over your canvas just because they bring you a new brush." It was a poetic warning Elena didn't fully understand then, but years later, it would haunt her like a prophecy fulfilled. That night, as Elena texted Ryan a sweet goodnight message and received a heart emoji in return, she was still floating in the glow of his affection. But outside, under the black velvet sky, Lydia stood by her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly before muttering to herself, "God, let me be wrong about this man. Please." The winter winds of December danced fiercely through the city, but inside Café Calliope, tucked behind the old University Theater, Elena felt an electric warmth that had nothing to do with the heaters. Ryan had invited her there for a business brainstorm, claiming he had something exciting to share. Elena, wrapped in her brown pea coat with a sketchbook poking from her tote, listened with wide eyes as Ryan scribbled diagrams and flowcharts on napkins. "It's a data-backed logistics system for independent vendors," he explained passionately, his voice a rhythm of confidence and vision. "Elena, this could change the way small businesses survive in a world ruled by conglomerates." He wasn't just pitching software, he was pitching revolution, and more than that, he was pitching them. "I want us to build this together," he said. "You bring the psychology and creative marketing, I handle the tech." It sounded like the dream she didn't even know she had. Then came the catch. He needed a capital injection to begin development. $20,000, he said calmly. "It's your savings, I know, but this is us. Trust me." The words "trust me" echoed in Elena's mind for days. Her scholarship covered most of her education, and she'd saved that money from working 3 jobs through undergrad, teaching painting at youth centers, late-night tutoring, waitressing during weekends. $20,000 wasn't just money. It was freedom, security, a potential down payment on her future art therapy studio. But Ryan made it sound like a shared destiny. "You said you wanted to change the world, Elle," he whispered one night as they watched snowfall outside her apartment window. "This is how we start." He cupped her face in his hands, kissed her forehead, and spoke of empires. She saw in him not just a lover but a fellow builder. And so, the next morning, with trembling fingers and a swelling heart, she transferred the funds. That night, Ryan blindfolded her and took her to the rooftop of his apartment, where string lights danced like stars across the concrete. There, with a single red rose and a velvet box, he dropped to one knee. "Let's make this forever official," he said, revealing a simple diamond ring. Tears flooded her cheeks, not because of the proposal, but because she truly believed this man was her forever. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, and yet, everything seemed perfect. Elena began integrating herself into Ryan's startup plans, creating mood boards and campaign concepts, drafting wellness pitches that paired business with emotional intelligence. He praised her constantly, calling her his co-pilot, his visionary anchor. They started looking at loft apartments closer to New York City, and he encouraged her to take a leave from her studies, just for a semester, to focus on building their future. Her friends were skeptical. Michelle, her cousin and closest confidant, tried to be gentle. "He's charming, Elena. But don't lose you in all of him." Lydia, on the other hand, was more direct. "That man's feeding you castles made of smoke. You better make sure your name's on the deed before he flies off with your wings." But Elena didn't want doubt. She wanted love, legacy, purpose. She told herself Ryan was simply misunderstood, overly ambitious, a little rushed but golden-hearted. She had no idea that behind the glimmering smile was a man who had long mastered the art of disguise, and that her love, her loyalty, and her savings were merely tools in his blueprint for deception. The St. Paul's Vineyard Chapel shimmered with soft lilac petals and golden lanterns, as Michelle Bradford, Elena's cousin and closest friend, walked down the aisle in a silk gold gown that hugged her like a whisper. It was the kind of wedding that felt like a fantasy dipped in realism, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and family legacy. Elena stood beside Michelle as maid of honor, her own dress a pale rose that matched the bouquet she clutched, though her mind wandered. Ryan was seated on the third row, chatting effortlessly with Elena's distant relatives, flashing that magnetic smile that won over strangers with ease. Yet, something about him that day felt disconnected. He arrived late, skipped the pre-wedding photos, and hadn't once complimented her appearance, an odd silence from the man who once likened her to moonlight. During the reception, when she finally pulled him aside to ask if something was wrong, he simply shrugged, sipped his bourbon, and said, "I just have a lot on my mind." The reception was held in a sun-drenched banquet hall nestled between wild lavender fields. The scent of wine and roasted lamb lingered in the air while old jazz records floated from corner speakers. Michelle's new husband, Aaron, delivered a heartfelt toast, drawing tears from both families, and Ryan took that as a cue to disappear into the crowd. Elena searched for him amidst the dancers, eventually finding him outside on the patio, deep in conversation with a stunning brunette in a wine-colored dress. She was tall, sharp-jawed, and wore confidence like it was tailored. As Elena approached, Ryan introduced her casually. "This is Jessica. She works with one of my potential investors." Jessica extended her hand with a perfect smile. "You're the artist," she said smoothly, her eyes assessing Elena from head to toe like a competitor sizing up the stakes. "Ryan told me your work is powerful." The pause before powerful wasn't missed. Though polite, the undertone was piercing. Elena offered a tight smile, shaking off the chill crawling up her spine. Jessica excused herself soon after, leaving behind a cloud of vanilla perfume and unspoken history. "She's just business," Ryan said flatly, taking a sip of champagne. Elena nodded. But her gut whispered otherwise. Later that night, while everyone else danced beneath string lights and sparklers, Elena sat beside Michelle in a corner booth, exhaustion hidden behind her smile. Michelle leaned in. "Is everything okay between you and Ryan?" Elena hesitated before answering, not wanting to sully her cousin's wedding night with her doubts. "He's just distracted with business stuff," she said, forcing a smile. Michelle didn't push, but her eyes lingered. The cake was cut. The vows were replayed. But Elena's heart felt heavier than it should have. As they drove home, Ryan was silent, absorbed in his phone with messages he didn't bother to hide. Elena stared out the window, her fingers twisting the edge of her dress, wondering when the warmth had started slipping through the cracks. Something was shifting, and though she couldn't quite name it yet, her soul had started bracing for a storm she didn't know was coming. The morning sun spilled through the linen curtains in Elena's apartment, golden and cruel, as if mocking the whirlwind of uncertainty swirling in her chest. She sat cross-legged on the bathroom floor, still in her oversized t-shirt, hands trembling as she stared at the small white stick resting on the edge of the sink. 2 lines. Faint but clear. Definite. The room seemed to close in around her, and her heart pounded with a confusing mix of awe, fear, and disbelief. For several minutes she said nothing, just stared. This wasn't in the plan, not yet. Not when Ryan was working day and night on meetings she wasn't included in anymore, when his phone now lived face down and locked, and when she hadn't seen his eyes soften at her smile in weeks. And yet, beneath her fear, a strange warmth bloomed. A child. Her child. A soul forming in the quiet recesses of her being. Tears slid down her cheeks, both joy and mourning. When Elena finally found the words and the courage to tell Ryan that evening, she chose the rooftop, the very place he had proposed just months earlier. She wore the blue wool scarf he once said brought out the fire in her eyes and brought a small sketch of a sunrise she had drawn that morning. As the city lights glowed beneath them, she took his hand and whispered, "I'm pregnant." Ryan blinked, stunned, not in awe, but like a man caught off guard during a business call. He didn't smile. He didn't even ask how she felt. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice low. "I mean, now? It's really not the right time, Elena. We're building something big here." The word stung like sleet. Elena stood frozen, watching as he ran a hand through his hair and sighed, muttering something about meetings, stress, and needing to process it all. That night, they lay in the same bed, inches apart, a silent canyon forming between their bodies. Elena stared at the ceiling long after he'd fallen asleep, one hand on her belly, whispering, "I've got you, little one. Even if no one else does." In the weeks that followed, Ryan became even more emotionally distant. He was always on a call, always stepping out for urgent meetings, and always returning home with the scent of cologne that wasn't his. Elena stopped asking questions she knew would be dodged. Instead, she turned inward. She reopened the closet that housed her forgotten canvases, dusted off her paintbrushes, and began to create again, not for profit, not for a gallery, but for her sanity. Her strokes were different now. Bolder. Angrier. Softer. In a single painting, she depicted a woman standing in a rainstorm, clutching her belly, as a faceless man disappeared in the distance. That painting, later titled Beginning Without Permission, would one day be her most famous. But for now, it was her diary. A cry in colors. Lydia noticed the shift, too. "You're painting again," she said during a visit, eyes warm. Elena just nodded. She didn't yet have the words for the storm forming on her horizon, but her art, her oldest refuge, was already bracing for the downpour to come. It happened on a Thursday. Elena remembered because she had just returned from her prenatal checkup, her belly rounding beautifully at 5 months, the heartbeat of her daughter still echoing in her ears. She came home humming, holding the ultrasound print like a sacred relic. But the apartment was quiet, eerily so. Ryan's jacket wasn't by the door. His shoes weren't on the mat. She assumed he'd stepped out for groceries, maybe coffee. An hour passed. Then 2. Then 6. She called his phone, voicemail. Texted. No reply. Her heart began racing, but logic tried to soothe her. He's busy. He'll call. But that call never came. Instead, the next morning, she found an envelope on the kitchen counter, her name scribbled hastily across the front. Inside were keys and a single note, "I need space. Don't contact me." No explanation. No goodbye. No mention of their child. The man who once held her like oxygen was now gone, leaving only silence where promises used to live. The days that followed blurred into a haze of disbelief and emotional paralysis. Elena searched hospitals, checked flight records, even filed a missing persons report, only to withdraw it after realizing his bank account had activity in California. Ryan hadn't vanished by force, he had chosen to leave. At first, she refused to believe it. She paced the apartment like a ghost, clutching her belly, whispering to her unborn daughter that Daddy would come home. But the apartment grew colder, and his absence louder. She stopped painting. She barely ate. Some nights, she sat by the door, convinced she'd hear his key turn. Then one morning, Lydia arrived unannounced, standing with a suitcase in one hand and a casserole dish in the other. She took one look at her daughter, pale, fragile, eyes swollen, and said, "You are not doing this alone." Without another word, she unpacked her things and scrubbed the kitchen floor while soup simmered on the stove. Elena broke down in her mother's arms that night, sobbing so violently she vomited twice. Lydia held her through it all, whispering, "We've got this. He may have left, but we stay." With Lydia's presence came a slow return to rhythm. Mornings began with herbal tea and soft jazz, afternoons were filled with doctor's appointments, nursery preparations, and walks through the snowy park. Lydia painted the nursery pale yellow and placed handwritten affirmations on the mirror. "You are enough. You are not alone. You are building something beautiful." Elena read them every day, even when she didn't believe them. The community of women at the local pregnancy resource center welcomed her like kin, and little by little, she began to breathe again. But the wound was deep. At night, she still reached across the bed unconsciously, hoping to find the man she once believed would never leave. Ryan's betrayal had cracked something in her soul, but something stronger was already forming in its place. Beneath the grief, Elena was evolving, not into someone colder, but into someone forged by fire. She no longer dreamed of Ryan returning. She dreamed of holding her daughter for the first time. And this time, her dream wasn't about love, it was about survival. The storm arrived without warning, as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled in fury. Snowflakes fell in violent sheets, blanketing Montpelier in a sea of white. The roads shimmered with ice, and visibility vanished behind gusts of powdered wind. Inside their small apartment, Elena clutched her swollen belly, doubled over as another contraction rippled through her. She had been timing them all morning, but now they came hard and fast, 5 minutes apart, then 3, then barely 2. Lydia, calm but visibly rattled, paced like a general preparing for war. The midwife they'd scheduled was snowed in, and every hospital line rang busy or redirected to emergency services. When Elena's water broke in the hallway, splashing down like the storm outside, Lydia knew they had no choice. "We're doing this here," she said, already boiling water and tearing bedsheets. Elena tried to steady her breath, tears streaming down her face, not from fear, but from the realization she was doing this without him. Time fractured. The next few hours passed in a blur of agony, primal strength, and maternal will. The living room transformed into a battlefield of towels, warm lamps, and whispered encouragement. Lydia held her daughter's hand through every scream, her voice steady as she counted down with each contraction. "You are strong, Elena. Just like my mama. Just like me. You were built for this." Blood and sweat soaked the sheets. Elena had never felt more afraid, more alive, or more connected to the unseen bond of women who had birthed in caves, shacks, shelters, and now, a Vermont apartment during a blizzard. And then, like a miracle wrapped in stormlight, a cry pierced the room. Sharp. Loud. Whole. Elena collapsed back into the makeshift bedding, tears pouring freely as Lydia wrapped the tiny child in warm blankets. The moment she held her daughter to her chest, everything else faded, Ryan's betrayal, the loneliness, the fear. "Mira," she whispered. "Because you're the miracle I never saw coming." For hours, the storm howled outside, but inside that little apartment, time stood still. Lydia curled up beside them on the floor, watching as Elena cradled Mira with trembling hands. She was so small, barely 7 pounds, with a full head of curls and wide, curious eyes that blinked up at the world like it owed her no apologies. Elena studied every feature, every wrinkle in her fingers, memorizing her child like scripture. She thought she would feel overwhelmed, terrified, but instead, she felt complete. Not whole in the way love stories promised, but in the way warriors feel when they walk off the battlefield with their purpose intact. This child would not be raised in the shadow of a man who chose ambition over family. She would be raised in color, in truth, in strength. That night, as the fire crackled and snow kissed the window panes, Elena didn't sleep. She painted Myra's name across her heart in silent vow, "You will never feel abandoned. Not while I breathe." 14 floors above Los Angeles traffic, the penthouse smelled of Cuban cigars, exotic perfumes, and corruption. Ryan Lockwood leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window with a tumbler of neat whiskey, watching the lights flicker like stars beneath him. It had been over a year since he left Vermont, no forwarding address, no explanation, no guilt. In L.A., he wasn't Elena's fiancé or soon-to-be father. Here, he was a ghost-turned-kingpin, reborn under Jessica Montana's mentorship. Jessica, fierce, seductive, lethal, was a former fashion model whose fall from the runway became her entrance into the underworld. After being scammed by an agent and arrested for carrying a package she never opened, she learned to control her destiny the hard way. By the time she met Ryan, she had already formed a boutique trafficking network disguised as a luxury logistics brand. What Ryan brought to the table wasn't charm, it was systems, tech, and fake investors to wash the money. Together, they were becoming untouchable, or so they thought. Jessica had always known how to weaponize vulnerability, hers and others. She never saw children as sacred, she saw them as unnoticed. No one suspects the little ones, she told Ryan one night while tracing her finger across a world map laid out on their glass table. Parents use them to sneak candy into movie theaters. We'll use them for something more profitable. At first, Ryan recoiled at the suggestion, but Jessica was a master manipulator. She wrapped the plan in luxury and logic, painting a picture where customs officers would never suspect plush toys or child backpacks laced with hidden compartments. Think of it as legacy, she whispered, sipping red wine and silk lingerie. You've got a daughter somewhere, right? You said Elena had a girl? Well, maybe it's time you become a real father. Her words were both poison and prophecy. It started as a joke, a drunk hypothetical. But within weeks, Ryan began researching legal loopholes, exploring custody laws, and calling in favors from shady lawyers. To Jessica, love was a tool. To Ryan, family had become currency. And Mira? Mira was now a pawn in a scheme that would stretch far beyond her mother's worst nightmares. Their empire expanded quietly, wrapped in a camouflage of startup culture and wellness branding. Jessica launched a children's learning initiative that operated as a shell front for the shipments they moved between Mexico and the U.S. using soft packaging, child-sized apparel, and stuffed animals with micrograms of synthetic opioids tucked beneath button seams. It was insidious and nearly undetectable. Ryan, now using a new alias for travel, had begun laying the groundwork to re-enter Myra's life, not as an absent father, but as a rescuer. People eat up redemption stories, he said. All I need is a custody win and a rebrand. Jessica smiled, adjusting her diamond bracelet. Then we'll own the next generation of smuggling. But beneath their calculated cruelty, karma was circling, quiet and deliberate, waiting for its time. Because the universe, unlike customs, doesn't need probable cause to deliver justice. And what they had built in shadows would one day face the light and burn. The community hall smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and instant coffee, the kind of sterile warmth that suggested comfort without fully delivering it. Folding chairs formed a circle in the center of the room, and at the front, a corkboard displayed paper butterflies bearing names written in colored marker. Healing isn't linear was written across the top in curving script. Elena sat near the window, her coat still wrapped around her, Mira nestled beside her with a juice box and crayons. She had almost turned around at the entrance, almost let shame swallow her whole, but Lydia's voice in her ear had been firm. You are not broken, baby. You're rebuilding. Around her, other mothers shared stories. A woman named Dana spoke of being widowed with twins. Another, Crystal, had left an abusive partner and was living in a shelter. For the first time in months, Elena didn't feel like a shattered singularity. She felt seen. Understood. And when the next speaker stepped forward, everything inside her stilled. Lucas Jameson was nothing like she expected. Tall, gentle-eyed, with the stillness of someone who had walked through fire and didn't feel the need to prove it. He introduced himself simply. My name's Lucas. I lost my wife, Clara, to leukemia 2 years ago. We have a daughter, Adri. She's 6. She thinks grief looks like a balloon. I think she's right. The group chuckled lightly, but Lucas's voice never lost its quiet gravity. He spoke not like a counselor, though he volunteered there, but like someone still carrying pieces of the people he lost. Elena watched him, not with romantic intrigue, but with a curiosity born of shared ache. When it was her turn, she hesitated before finally speaking. "My name is Elena. My daughter Mira is almost 1. Her father left when I was pregnant." The words came out steadier than she expected. No tears. Just facts. Lucas looked at her, not with pity, but with recognition. That unspoken language of survivors. After the meeting, as Mira showed Adri her crayon drawing of a purple bear, Lucas approached with 2 paper cups of coffee. "It gets easier," he said gently. Elena gave a weak smile. "I'm still trying to believe that." They talked about the group, about how healing can sometimes look like repetition, like showing up. Lucas never asked about Ryan, never prodded. Instead, he told her about Clara's love for poetry and how he'd once tried to cook pancakes and nearly burned down his kitchen. It was the first time Elena laughed, truly laughed, in months. Not because of love, not because she needed someone, but because she felt momentarily weightless. As Mira tugged on her coat sleeve and they prepared to leave, Lucas offered a quiet farewell. "See you next week?" Elena nodded slowly. "Yeah. I think so." That night, she didn't cry. She didn't paint. She simply stood at the window, watching snow fall again, and whispered to the sky, "We're going to be okay." The small red brick school stood like a beacon on the corner of Maple and Hartwell, its playground swaying with paper lanterns and tiny sneakers as parents clustered for the first day of kindergarten. Mira clutched Elena's hand tightly, her backpack too big for her frame and her curls bouncing with each nervous step. Elena crouched to her daughter's eye level, adjusting the hood of her pink jacket and whispering, "You are magic, baby girl. They're lucky to have you." Mira nodded solemnly, gripping the edges of her paint-stained lunchbox. Inside it was a folded napkin with a heart drawn in crayon and the words "Be bold. Be bright." It was Elena's mantra, and now Myra's armor. When the teacher called roll, Elena stood at the door longer than the other parents, watching as her daughter stepped into a world she could no longer fully protect. Her chest ached with pride, joy, and something deeper, an ache she couldn't name. Weeks passed, and Mira blossomed. Her teachers described her as whimsical and wise, her classmates as quiet but kind. She brought drawings home each day, galaxies, ballerinas, stars in jars, and asked endless questions about dreams, colors, and whether clouds had feelings. Then came the announcement of the school's fall talent show, and to Elena's surprise, Mira insisted she wanted to paint live on stage. "I want to show people what I see in my sleep," she said, eyes wide with determination. Elena helped her prepare, buying new brushes and encouraging her daughter to paint boldly. The auditorium was packed the night of the show. Parents held up phones, teachers clapped, and each child performed with wide-eyed wonder. When it was Myra's turn, she stepped onto the stage, a single spotlight illuminating her easel. She dipped her brush in violet, gold, and cobalt, creating a cosmic swirl that made the audience fall silent. And when she finished, she turned to the crowd and simply said, "This is my world. It's full of hope." At the very back of the auditorium, behind the last row of folding chairs and half hidden beneath a navy ball cap, Ryan Lockwood stood in the shadows. He hadn't planned on being there, Jessica had warned him against it, but curiosity had burned through him. Mira looked just like Elena, but her presence was something else entirely. Confident. Magnetic. Unreachable. His heart twisted with something unfamiliar. Was it pride? Regret? Or just the calculating realization of how useful such a bright child could be to his growing empire? He didn't know, and maybe didn't care. All he saw was potential. When the audience erupted into applause and Elena rushed the stage to hug her daughter, Ryan's jaw clenched. He turned and walked away before they could spot him, but not before taking one last look at the child he once left behind. "It's time," he murmured beneath his breath. "She's ready." Outside, the night air was crisp. But inside Ryan's mind, plans were already forming, and Mira was now the centerpiece. It was a Wednesday morning like any other, parents kissing foreheads, teachers welcoming yawning little bodies into the schoolyard, and Elena waiting patiently near the oak tree beside the painted hopscotch path. Mira had forgotten her sweater again, and Vermont's early frost had crept in overnight. Elena waved as she saw her daughter approach from the classroom doors, laughing alongside two friends, her curls bouncing like little halos. But then, everything shifted. Her daughter paused mid-step, confusion flickering across her face. "Daddy," she whispered, loud enough to jolt Elena from her spot. There, at the edge of the school gate, stood a man Elena hadn't seen in over 4 years, Ryan. Trimmed beard, tailored coat, sunglasses, and a calculated smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Elena's blood ran cold. Time slowed. Her heart raced. She dropped the sweater and instinctively stepped in front of Mira, her voice sharp and firm. "What are you doing here?" Ryan's smile widened. "I'm here for my daughter." The world tilted, and Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. Ryan's presence wasn't just unexpected, it was invasive. He looked too put together, too confident, as if this appearance had been rehearsed. Teachers nearby paused, sensing tension but unsure of context. Mira looked between her parents, her small face a blend of curiosity and confusion. "You can't just show up," Elena snapped, her voice shaking. "You don't get to be here." Ryan pulled a neatly folded document from his coat, an official-looking letter stamped by a firm Elena didn't recognize. "I've started custody proceedings," he said calmly, like he was discussing weekend brunch. "And I thought it was time I reconnected with my daughter." "Don't worry, everything will be legal." Elena's knees weakened. The letter trembled in her hand as she read the firm's name, Silver and Dolan Custodial Law. She'd never heard of them. Her thoughts scattered. Ryan leaned down and waved at Mira. "Hi, sweetheart. Remember me?" Mira gave a hesitant smile, her voice uncertain. "I think so." Elena clutched her daughter's hand and turned away, her mind already dialing a number she hadn't used in months, Michelle. That night, the kitchen table was covered in legal pads, coffee mugs, and tears. Michelle Bradford, now working as a licensed paralegal for a growing family law firm in Burlington, sat across from Elena, scanning the document Ryan had delivered. "This is real," she said slowly. "But something about it feels rushed. Like a move in a bigger game." Elena held Mira close on the couch, trying not to cry. "He just appeared, Michelle. Out of nowhere. Like the past never happened." Michelle looked at her cousin with steady eyes. "He doesn't want her because he loves her. He wants her for leverage, or worse." Elena's hands trembled. "How do I stop him?" Michelle straightened, already outlining her plan. "We document everything. We challenge his history. And if he wants a war, then damn it, we'll give him one." Outside, frost covered the windows. Inside, Elena knew, this wasn't a visit. It was a calculated strike. And she would not surrender. The courtroom smelled of old wood, cold metal, and quiet judgment. Elena sat at the plaintiff's table beside Michelle, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as the bailiff called the case, Lockwood versus Bradford. Her heart thundered in her chest. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been planning Myra's 6th birthday party with handmade invitations and a butterfly cake design. Now she was fighting to keep her child. Judge Hamilton Cole entered with a stern face, his presence commanding instant silence. Elena's eyes flicked across the room to the defense table, where Ryan sat with a smug expression and a perfectly pressed navy suit, his new attorney, slick-haired and sharp-tongued, at his side. Elena had dreamed of seeing him face the truth, the consequences. She never imagined their first encounter in years would be under fluorescent lights, surrounded by legal files and the fate of a child hanging in the balance. This was no longer personal. It was war, with witnesses, strategies, and lies. The proceedings began formally, motions, case introductions, acknowledgement of both parties. Michelle stood firmly and presented their case. Ryan had no prior involvement with Myra's upbringing, no consistent support, and a documented history of abandonment. Elena's role as primary caregiver was detailed through medical records, school reports, and community affidavits. Then it was Ryan's turn. His lawyer rose with a polite but venom-laced tone, announcing their intent to seek full custody on the grounds of moral instability and child endangerment. Elena froze. The room seemed to narrow. "We have reason to believe," the attorney continued, "that Ms. Bradford has recently relapsed into recreational drug use and is, therefore, unfit to provide a safe and stable environment for a minor." A gasp erupted from Elena before she could stop it. "That's a lie," she said, rising to her feet. Judge Cole banged the gavel. "Order." Michelle pulled her down gently, whispering, "Stay calm. He's trying to shake you." Elena blinked through tears. She had been blindsided, publicly accused without evidence, and Ryan never even flinched. Michelle requested an immediate rebuttal, but Judge Cole ordered an investigation before further arguments. Elena would be subjected to a court-mandated drug test and home evaluation. Until the results returned, temporary custody was frozen. Mira would remain in Elena's care under monitoring. As they left the courtroom, Elena could hardly breathe. Outside the courthouse steps, Ryan approached with mock sympathy. "It's nothing personal," he said coolly. "But I have a right to be in my daughter's life, and courts need proof, not feelings." Elena stared at him, stunned by his audacity. "You disappeared for 5 years." He smirked. "And now I'm back." Michelle pulled her away before Elena could say more. Back home, Elena cradled Mira tightly in her arms and stared at the pale sky outside her window, realizing this was no longer about being right. It was about protecting the one thing that still made her whole, and she was prepared to fight until the last breath. The sterile clinic room was lit by fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead as Elena sat motionless in the waiting chair, fingers laced tightly around her phone. The court-mandated drug screening had been humiliating. She had nothing to hide, but the implication alone had shredded her spirit. The nurse had been kind but clinical, assuring her the results would be processed immediately. As she left, Elena felt stripped of her dignity, her role as a mother now tethered to a vial and lab results. 2 days later, Michelle called with the confirmation, negative. Clean. Elena wept in her kitchen, clutching Myra's favorite stuffed rabbit, the weight of accusation finally breaking into sobs. She expected vindication, expected Ryan's case to collapse in on itself now that his claim had been disproven. But in court, truth wasn't always the deciding factor. That was a lesson she was about to learn the hardest way possible. The following week, during a hearing meant to review the drug test results, Ryan's attorney calmly announced a new development. A longtime friend of Elena's had come forward with sworn testimony claiming they had witnessed her using substances on multiple occasions just a year ago. The courtroom fell still. Elena's brows furrowed as the witness entered, Tasha Granger, a former college acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 years. Tasha sat confidently, fabricated conviction dripping from every word. She described imaginary parties, alleged pill abuse, and even claimed Mira had once been left unattended. Elena was too stunned to breathe. Michelle's objection was swift, but Judge Cole allowed the testimony to be entered pending verification. When court recessed, Elena cornered Tasha outside, demanding answers, but the woman simply looked away. Michelle later learned that Tasha had received a quiet wire transfer 2 days before her appearance, money traced back to a dummy LLC owned by one of Ryan's shell companies. But the damage was already done. Despite the negative drug test, the conflicting testimony was enough for Judge Cole to suspend primary custody temporarily, pending a full investigation. Mira would be placed under supervised care between both parents. Elena felt her knees give out in the hallway as the order was read. The courtroom echoed in her ears, but all she heard was her daughter crying when they tried to take her hand. That night, Elena sat alone in Myra's empty room, her fingers tracing every picture on the wall, every toy that still held her child's scent. "I'm not broken," she whispered to herself through clenched teeth. "And I will prove it." Across town, Ryan raised a glass with Jessica, celebrating this temporary win. But in his eyes was a hunger that had nothing to do with fatherhood and everything to do with power. Elena had just lost the battle, but what they didn't know was that she was quietly preparing to win the war. Michelle sat hunched over a pile of printed bank statements and court transcripts, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses as Detective Gabriel Ramirez paced the length of her office. It had taken days of digging, but patterns were finally surfacing. Ryan's supposedly legitimate logistics company, Lockwood Global Connect, had funding trails that circled back to offshore accounts flagged in federal narcotics investigations. One document caught Michelle's eye, a corporate payment from an LLC in Nevada, dated exactly 2 days before the witness, Tasha Granger, testified in court. "That's no coincidence," Ramirez muttered, pulling his notebook closer. "And that LLC," he added, flipping through the records. "It's tied to a known smuggler out of Mexico." They both knew what that meant. Ryan wasn't just trying to win custody, he was laundering criminal assets through his fake corporate front. The implications were enormous. "We need a judge to reopen the case," Michelle said. "But we'll need proof, undeniable proof, to expose everything." Ramirez nodded. "And I know just where to look." At the family court filing office downtown, Lucas Jameson waited quietly in the corridor, holding a brown envelope marked custodial petition errors. As a volunteer social worker familiar with filing, he'd seen hundreds of custody applications, but Ryan seemed too perfect. It was Elena's trembling voice during their last support group meeting that prompted him to request a duplicate. As he cross-referenced Ryan's original filing with the court-stamped copy Elena had received, his jaw tightened. Ryan had slipped in an outdated address and a forged signature from a therapist who had never evaluated Elena. Lucas took a deep breath and scanned the forms again. A fraud like this meant the petition could be challenged, and if verified, could lead to criminal charges. He immediately called Michelle, who met him outside with Ramirez. They compared notes, and the energy between them shifted. No longer were they gathering shadows, they were building light. Real, tangible light. "It's time we go on the offensive," Michelle said. "He thinks we're playing defense. Let's blindside him." The following morning, Ryan arrived at Myra's supervised visit, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, playing the role of a doting father while Jessica waited in a black SUV outside. But his performance was interrupted when Lydia Bradford appeared across the courtyard, storming through the school parking lot with her scarf trailing behind her like a banner of fury. Parents and staff turned as Lydia marched up to Ryan, her voice calm but thunderous. "You used to be a coward. Now you're just a liar." Ryan's smirk faltered. "Stay out of this, Lydia." She stepped closer and, without hesitation, delivered a resounding slap across his face, loud enough to silence the crowd. Gasps rang out, but Lydia didn't flinch. "That's for my daughter. And for my granddaughter." Security escorted her away, but the damage was done. That moment became the whisper of something bigger, something unfolding. Because while Ryan still thought he held the cards, the real reckoning had only just begun. The courtroom was silent as Judge Hamilton Cole reviewed the temporary ruling, his expression unreadable. Elena sat on the edge of her seat, her fingers gripping Michelle's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the aisle, Ryan leaned back in his chair, feigning patience, while Jessica sat behind him with oversized sunglasses and an artificial look of concern. When the judge finally spoke, his words cracked the air like a whip. "In light of conflicting testimonies and pending investigation, this court grants temporary custody to the biological father, Mr. Ryan Lockwood." Elena's mouth went dry. The breath in her lungs turned into a scream she couldn't voice. The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted into a blur of murmurs. She rose to her feet, but her legs gave out beneath her. Michelle caught her just before she hit the ground. "He's taking her," Elena whispered, tears streaking down her face. "He's taking my baby." That evening, Elena sat in a sterile hospital bed with an IV in her arm, heart monitors blinking quietly behind her. The paramedics had rushed her in after she collapsed from a panic attack on the courthouse steps. Her eyes remained unfocused, her mind somewhere between rage and despair. Lydia sat beside her, stroking her hand, while Michelle paced the room with clenched fists. "He can't keep her," Michelle said. "We're going to overturn this." I swear it. But her words were distant to Elena, muted behind the grief clawing inside her. Mira had never spent a night away from her mother, not one. Elena kept seeing her daughter's little hands reaching for her as the social worker drove her away, her sobs echoing in the back seat. "Tell Mommy I'll wait for her," Mira had said. Those words looped endlessly in Elena's mind like a cruel lullaby. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical. As if part of her body had been carved out and left behind. At Ryan and Jessica's estate, Mira sat quietly on a velvet cushion in a pristine bedroom that looked more like a showroom than a home. Jessica brought in a tray of macarons and smiled as she set it down beside her. "You'll love it here, Princess," she said sweetly, kneeling to Mira's eye level. "We'll have fun, okay?" Mira didn't answer. She clutched the small cloth rabbit Elena had sewn for her last Christmas and stared out the window. Ryan entered moments later, feigning warmth as he knelt beside her. "You remember Daddy, right?" he asked gently. Mira gave a tiny nod, but her eyes held no trust. Later that night, as Jessica closed the door behind them, she whispered to Ryan, "Give it a few weeks. She'll adjust. Then we can start." Ryan lit a cigar on the patio, watching the stars. "Yeah," he said. "Once she trusts us, she'll carry everything we need. But karma doesn't knock. It waits, and now, it was listening." The mansion echoed at night. Despite its chandeliers and marble floors, it lacked warmth, no scattered toys, no bedtime stories, no mother's embrace. Mira tiptoed down the hallway with her stuffed rabbit in hand, searching for the lavender blanket her mother used to wrap her in after baths. She couldn't sleep. The rooms felt too cold, and the walls didn't hum with lullabies like home. As she passed her father's study, she paused at the door slightly ajar. Inside, Ryan and Jessica spoke in hushed tones, unaware of the child listening. "She's quiet and obedient," Jessica whispered. "We just need her to carry the next set in a bear. We've stuffed it with microsealants, undetectable at customs." Ryan replied, "You're sure the agents won't scan her?" Jessica chuckled. "They'll wave her through. Kids are invisible." Myra's tiny heart pounded. She didn't understand all the words, but she knew they were wrong. Very wrong. She backed away quietly, her rabbit pressed tightly to her chest. The next day, Myra's supervised school visit began like any other. She wore the yellow sundress Elena loved and kept her backpack clutched to her chest, inside which was the same bear Jessica had touched the night before. The social worker, Ms. Riley, monitored her as she joined her classmates in the art room. But Mira didn't paint. She didn't laugh. Her brush barely touched the page. At snack time, she asked softly if she could speak with her teacher, Ms. Lorna James, in private. The teacher, a kind woman in her 50s with a soft spot for quiet children, obliged. Mira sat down, eyes wide and voice trembling. "Ms. James, is it bad if people hide things in toys?" The teacher frowned gently. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Mira hesitated, then opened her backpack, holding up the stuffed rabbit. "I think my daddy and the other lady are doing something bad. They said I'd carry stuff, so no one checks." Ms. James froze. Her instincts kicked in. She kept her tone calm but firm. "Thank you for telling me, Mira. That was very brave." What followed happened quickly, like dominoes falling in fast succession. Ms. James immediately alerted the school administrator, who contacted the authorities and Child Protective Services. Mira was escorted to a private room under school care, while her bear was handed over for examination. What they found inside sent shockwaves through law enforcement, a professionally stitched packet of powdered synthetic opioid, embedded between layers of plush stuffing. Within hours, Detective Gabriel Ramirez received the alert. He ordered a discreet lockdown on Ryan and Jessica's estate, placing them under surveillance while gathering warrants. Meanwhile, Elena, still recovering from her breakdown, was contacted by Michelle and told that Mira was safe. Tears burst from her eyes as she fell to her knees. "She told someone," she whispered in awe. "She told." In that moment, Elena didn't feel broken anymore. She felt like a mother whose child had found her voice. What Ryan had underestimated was not Elena's strength, but Myra's. The air was thick with tension as unmarked SUVs rolled up to the gates of Ryan Lockwood's estate under the velvet darkness of 4 a.m. Federal agents, dressed in black with the DEA insignia barely visible under their vests, moved in synchronized silence, executing a coordinated raid under sealed warrants. Inside, Ryan had just taken a late-night call with one of his international suppliers when floodlights lit up the yard like daylight. "What the?" he barked, but before he could reach for his burner phone, the front door exploded open. Jessica screamed as she scrambled for a closet, but within minutes both were handcuffed, disarmed, and separated. In the living room, an agent held up a children's suitcase filled with teddy bears identical to Myra's. "Exactly the same construction," he said grimly. In the basement, they uncovered rows of hidden crates disguised as school supply donations, each laced with concealed narcotics. The game was over, and the world was watching. By noon, every major news outlet in Vermont had picked up the story. A once-respected tech entrepreneur and his philanthropic partner arrested in a drug smuggling ring involving child trafficking proxies. Elena sat at her kitchen table in disbelief, watching the footage unfold, Ryan being led away in cuffs, Jessica screaming at reporters, and federal agents cataloging evidence. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with vindication. Michelle rushed into the room with her laptop, eyes wide. "The judge is holding an emergency review. We need to get there now." At the courthouse, Judge Hamilton Cole looked sterner than ever. "New evidence has emerged indicating intentional deception, criminal endangerment, and witness tampering," he said in his opening remarks. "The court is immediately reopening the custody case and placing the child under emergency protective care with her mother, effective now." Elena could barely breathe as the courtroom blurred through her tears. Her fingers pressed against her lips in stunned silence. The moment she'd fought for, cried for, had finally come. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed as Elena held Mira tightly against her chest, protective and fierce, refusing to let go. Flashbulbs snapped, questions were shouted, but all she heard was her daughter's soft voice whispering, "Mommy, can we go home now?" Michelle held the car door open, shielding them from the crowd, while Detective Ramirez approached with a file in his hand. "Ms. Bradford," he said, his voice low, "there's enough here for a federal conviction. We're preparing to charge both defendants with narcotics trafficking, defamation, endangerment of a minor, and obstruction of justice." Elena met his eyes, her own calm but fiery. "Make sure they never touch another child again." As they drove home, Mira sat curled against her, humming a lullaby Elena used to sing when she was a baby. Outside, the world buzzed with chaos. Inside their car, peace settled, for the first time in a very long time. But the war wasn't just won. It had been survived. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, reporters lining the back with cameras discreetly tucked beside notepads, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Judge Hamilton Cole presided from the bench with a gaze as cold as granite, the weight of the nation's attention pressing heavily on the room. Ryan sat in a gray prison uniform, wrists cuffed tightly, his smirk gone, replaced by a hardened silence. Jessica, seated beside him in matching orange, avoided eye contact with everyone, her face pale, her designer confidence long evaporated. As federal prosecutors presented their closing statements, the evidence was overwhelming: customs reports, digital transactions, tracking of smuggled goods, court-forged documents, and the damning recordings Myra's teacher had submitted. Elena sat quietly at the front, Mira nestled against her side, clutching her mother's hand. This time, there were no interruptions, no lies left to shield them. Ryan had finally run out of disguises. The empire he built on manipulation had collapsed in front of the world. Judge Cole's voice echoed across the room as he read the sentencing with deliberate weight. "Ryan Lockwood and Jessica Montana, this court finds you guilty on all counts: narcotics trafficking, defamation, obstruction of justice, perjury, and the attempted endangerment of a child. You are hereby sentenced to 60 years in federal prison, without eligibility for parole." A gasp moved through the courtroom, but Elena's expression didn't change. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and exhaled, one long, shuddering breath as if releasing the final poison from her soul. Ryan tried to speak, to twist his final words into apology or justification, but Judge Cole silenced him with a raised hand. "You had a daughter," he said coldly. "Not a mule. And not a weapon." As bailiffs escorted them away, Jessica broke down, screaming about injustice and betrayal, but no one listened. For the first time, Ryan and Jessica were exactly what they had tried to make Elena feel: powerless, voiceless, exposed. Outside, the sun had never looked brighter. Elena stepped through the courthouse doors to a round of applause, not from spectators, but from fellow single mothers, teachers, and advocates who had followed her journey quietly and now surrounded her like a protective circle of light. Mira beamed beside her, her curls tied in two proud buns, holding the same rabbit that once carried danger, but now symbolized survival. Reporters asked for interviews. Publishers called for book deals. But Elena declined them all. Her only concern was getting her daughter home, safe and free. Lucas met her by the parking lot with flowers from the support group, his smile warm and brotherly. "You didn't just win, Elena," he said, voice soft. "You ended it." As she placed Mira into the back seat, Elena looked up at the sky, not for thanks, but for release. The battle was over. The truth had won. And for the first time, the chains of shame were no longer hers to carry. The smell of turpentine and aged canvas filled the quiet air of Elena's attic studio, sunlight streaking through the skylight like divine brushstrokes. It had been years since she'd stood in this space, truly present. Dust still lingered in the corners, and unused easels stood like silent witnesses to her former self, the girl who once painted to escape, who had forgotten that her art wasn't just expression, it was identity. Mira sat on a stool nearby, humming softly as she dipped her fingers into acrylics, creating small galaxies on a blank canvas. Elena moved slowly across the room, running her fingers over old sketchbooks, cracked palettes, unfinished portraits. Then she saw it, beginning without permission, the painting she started during her pregnancy. It was no longer just a wounded woman in a storm. Now, she knew what she had survived. She pulled up a fresh canvas, picked up her brush, and began painting again, not to forget the past, but to transform it. That afternoon, a courier knocked on her door with a sealed envelope addressed from the Vermont family court. Elena's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a simple, typed letter signed by Judge Hamilton Cole. "This court recognizes Elena Bradford as the sole, permanent guardian of Mira Lockwood. All parental rights of Ryan Lockwood are permanently terminated. No more visits. No more loopholes." It was over. She read the words twice, then 3 times, before pressing the paper to her heart. "We're free," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Mira came running, asking if everything was okay. Elena scooped her daughter into her arms and spun her in a slow circle, kissing her cheeks as laughter mingled with tears. Lydia walked in moments later, holding a tray of lemonade, and saw the glow in her daughter's eyes. No words were needed. The war had been brutal, but her baby girl had made it home. And Elena? She had been remade in fire, and chosen peace. That night, when the world slept, Elena put the finishing touches on her new painting. Titled Freedom in Pieces, it depicted a shattered silhouette stitched together with gold leaf, standing tall with a child perched on her shoulders, pointing toward a sunrise. Behind them, storm clouds faded into light. She stared at it for a long time, her heart beating steadily, her breath calm for the first time in years. Her phone buzzed with invitations to speak, exhibit, and publish, but she turned them all down. For now, all she wanted was simplicity: breakfast pancakes, bedtime stories, paint under her nails, and laughter on her daughter's lips. As she packed her brushes and turned off the studio lights, Mira tiptoed into the room holding a blanket. "Can I sleep beside you tonight, Mommy?" Elena smiled and nodded. "Always." In that moment, she knew, scars might remain, but pain was no longer her master. Love was. The sun poured golden light through the windows of the newly opened Aurora Studio and Sanctuary, a community space nestled at the corner of Oak and Harrow. Inside, the walls pulsed with life, bright murals painted by survivors, poems etched in charcoal, canvases filled with dreams that once felt lost. Elena stood near the entrance, wearing denim overalls smeared with paint, watching as guests wandered through her first official exhibition in nearly 7 years. But this wasn't about prestige or profit. It was about giving voice to women who had been silenced, forgotten, abandoned. Single mothers who had crawled through nights with no electricity and hearts full of fear. Young girls who had been told they were too broken to matter. The space buzzed with music, soft laughter, and the scent of lavender oil. Mira ran through the room with a group of children, leading them toward a Paint Your Dreams corner. Elena smiled, her chest full, not of pain, but of purpose. Among the guests were women from the same support group that had once saved her, Dana, Crystal, even Ms. Lorna James, who had become like a second grandmother to Mira. Lucas stood beside the refreshments table, chatting with Lydia, who looked proud in her handmade purple scarf. No one mentioned Ryan. No one needed to. His shadow no longer lived here. A framed letter from Judge Cole hung beside the front desk, reminding every visitor that justice could be won, even when the road is scorched. Elena had created a new definition of success, one painted not with fame, but with resilience, grace, and community. Mira paused beside her mother, holding up a tiny canvas she had just finished, a field of stars, with 2 women standing arm in arm, facing the sky. "That's you and Grandma," she said proudly. "I made you tall like heroes." Elena knelt down and kissed her forehead. "You made us brave, baby girl." There were no reporters here, no cameras. Just healing. Just beginnings. As dusk settled and the last guests trickled out, Elena stood alone beneath the string lights, breathing in the silence. The wind brushed against her skin like a soft whisper, and for the first time in years, it didn't carry echoes of fear. Mira tugged at her hand. "Can we paint tomorrow too?" Elena nodded. "We can paint every day if we want." They walked home under the stars, past the bench where Elena once sat pregnant and abandoned, now reclaimed by flowers and laughter. Her studio key jingled in her pocket beside a small photograph, her and Mira, hand in hand, eyes closed, smiling. Life hadn't just resumed. It had restarted. There were scars, yes, but they were no longer open wounds. They were stories now. Lessons. Reminders of how far they'd come. Elena looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me break." Because some women weren't just survivors. They were rebirth in human form. The end.